You will likely injure yourself at some point, and that is fine.
Look how dangerous this is. Imagine the facet joints, the strain. And I was thinking, this is a position we put babies in.
This whole like engage your core, zip your belly button in beautifully feeds into diet culture and make yourself as small as possible.
When people say mind body connection, I'm like, there is no separation.
Or lots of people say they experience emotional release.
Really, we can actually store emotions in any part of the body.
Business is business, but losing our moral compass is the other thing.
Yay! At last, I've got Lena Starzinska, who is Starlike Movement on Instagram, here today on Love at First Science. Welcome, Lena.
Hello, hello, good morning. I actually can't believe I'm on this podcast now. Do you know I've been recommending it to my members on Starlike throughout the last year, and a lot of them are big fans of some of your interviews with James Nestor or with Dr. Mukta Chandra. They are fan favorites on Starlike, so it's amazing to be here.
I am so touched that you have been listening and also recommending Love at First Science, because we put so much love into this podcast. And I really try and find people that are a little bit different, that are really educating people beyond our traditional forms. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on Love at First Science, because you teach movement, you teach Pilates, but you do it in a way that I have not seen many people do. And I'm hoping actually that you go viral, that you can spread your message even in a bigger way, because I really want more people to kind of listen carefully to the way you teach, because you're using such beautiful language to help people reconnect with their bodies, but also not to be afraid of their bodies. And that's all that we're going to be sharing today.
It is really something I feel, if you say like, oh, I feel passionate about it, it sounds so incredibly generic. But I think, we all come to our paths based kind of on our own frustrations and our own journey. And I definitely for years thought I'm not a fit person or a healthy person, or working out isn't for me. And eventually coming up to the realization that maybe the mainstream narratives around movement don't resonate with me, and I actually feel deeply disconnected from my body, but it really doesn't have to be this way. And this big belief I try to share with people on Starlike, which is my movement platform, and on Instagram, of course, is that movement really is natural. It is like eating and sleeping. It's undeniable. We're designed to move. And I'm not here to say you're designed to go to the gym or designed to do my classes or Celeste classes. I invite you to do so, but more so that even though the traditional narratives around movement can be so strict, and there's so much around what you should or shouldn't do, and what health means and what health doesn't mean, and it can feel so alienating, both in terms of your lifestyle, in terms of what your body looks like. So much of it is truly rooted in a very specific physical aesthetic that I don't even want to say it's not achievable for many people, because that even putting it this way sounds like somehow this is something we should strive for. But that movement really is natural. It shouldn't be a performance, and it can be an experience both for your mind and body, the mind body, if we look at our system as a whole. And I feel like there is a way forward in it, sort of as a society, for lack of a better word, that we could experience life a little bit differently if we reconnect with our bodies.
Yeah, I think the term that you used, which really struck a chord with me, was how people are so drained and disconnected from their bodies.
They really are. And especially, I wonder if you agree with this, but the separation kind of even saying mind and body, I've been trying to slowly almost to say it less, because I feel like sometimes we have this impression that we have a neck, this little bridge, and then you have your head, and then you have your rational mind and all this stuff, and then you have your body where you have your muscles and bones, and they kind of don't really coexist. Versus really there's so much, I want to emphasize this. I think each person is so much more than their physical body, but at the same time, our body is also how we experience the world. This is not my quote, and I've been struggling to find the person who originally said this, but the metaphor was that our body is like a lens, almost like a camera lens to the world. And then movement is just kind of keeping this lens clean. So you open yourself up to other experiences and sort of going through life with ease. Even if you're someone who doesn't necessarily maybe enjoy different parts of moving, looking after your body as a whole is just absolutely fundamental. But there's different ways to do it.
There are. Can I just take a quick step back? When you were talking about how people think, like, yes, this is my brain, which is my mind, and then here's my little bridge, which is my neck, and then there's the body. I cannot tell you how many times when I'm talking about functional neurology and how to weave it into training, people will say the statement, "Oh, does that improve your mind-body connection?" And I'm like, you can't do anything with your body unless your brain is involved, guys. Like, those muscles are not firing if you haven't got the neural impulse telling
Oh,
those muscles to work. And so when people say mind body connection, I'm like, there is no separation. Like, you need your brain to move.
oh, absolutely. And I think because almost in the popular narrative, there is so few ways to connect with your body. Like, okay, you can go to a gym or to a fitness class and burn, or you could go to a massage or other ways you could experience physical pleasure. And it almost feels like, okay, so there's like pain and pleasure in your body and that's it. Versus our senses work in such intricate ways. I don't know if I have the correct ways to describe it with my words, but I'm sure, or I hope many of us could agree that there's so many different experiences we can have in our body. Like imagine, I don't know, you climb a mountain, you climb some hill, and you have this like, deep breath, and you feel so good and so energized. And maybe that experience is a little bit different for each one of us. But what I'm saying is that sort of in our culture right now, the body is just like, okay, it looks a certain way, and we think about separate muscle groups in a really particular way, and it kind of disconnects us from this one big whole. And I don't know I don't know what your take on this is, but oftentimes, commonly in yoga, there is a talk that, or lots of people say they experience a emotional release during hip openers. And I'm sure there is a really big conversation about whether there is anything factual in it or anything subjective, but at least in my view, it does tend to happen. People do say, like, why is this? Why is this? I don't think I have one answer, but just my personal interpretation is almost that hip is a big joint. The sensations that come from it are intense just by virtue of its size. And almost because sometimes we're so disconnected from feeling into our body, when we're faced with all these sensations in a big stretch, it can feel like, whoa, what's happening? Like, what's coming up here? But this is actually just you. Like, it's not the mind and body separation. You are just feeling, experiencing yourself, I think.
Yeah, totally. There's so much that goes into that, particularly with past traumas around the pelvic floor and people who delivered children. The hips are like and also a lot of visceral nociceptive input, which is like sort of threat signals, will be centered around that area. But really, we can actually store emotions in any part of the body. So, for example, I think I was doing some manual therapy on someone's diaphragm, and they had a very strong emotional reaction because they had a car accident, and that area of their body was hurt through broken ribs. So, I think even if maybe as a child you were wrapped over the fingers through corporal punishment, let's say, for example, and someone goes to touch your hands in a certain way, that could also evoke an emotional response. I think people focus particularly on the hips because of these past experiences. But one of the big reasons I also wanted to chat to you was because we share very much a commonality around safety culture, and the fact that it's kind of limiting for people. And I really wanted to get your take and tell us more about what has been your experience looking at movement, starting Starlike, and what are some of the comments that you've heard from people, and how do you deal with this?
So, and I want to emphasize it here that mine and Celeste's conversation here will not have any judgment, because a lot of the things we are going to speak about, at least I would say for myself, I was a chief offender in that department. And I feel me too. Yeah. And I feel passionate around sort of reframing the dialogue around it, because I feel like I was so limited by my beliefs. Let me explain. So I teach Pilates and movement, but I am also a trained yoga teacher. I still actually take yoga teacher trainings and a bar teacher and sort of among other disciplines. And when I did my first training, which was at my local studio, enjoyed it, but the anatomy was really lacking. I remember on the exam at the end of the training, the only anatomy question was name the 3 bones in the shoulder. And that's it. Oh. So, and after leaving the training, I was kind of like, I felt like, do I really have the information enough to lead a group class? And, there's questions around what yoga is and what isn't, but I felt like, okay, I'm coming in front of these people. I need to know some stuff. And I started studying biomechanics, and I did even some really dedicated trainings that show yoga from a very biomechanical point of view. view. And this was the only way I knew anatomy, and it was such a wealth of knowledge. But sometimes the knowledge was really inflexible, to put it politely. It was shown from one extreme way. And the reason maybe me and Celeste are sharing this conversation, because if you haven't been hearing different voices explain different perspective on recent evidence, on neurobiology, on biomechanics, on physiology, you may feel like there's only one correct narrative. And that's sort of what I would consider today a little bit of an old school narrative, is heavily rooted in safety, sort of injury prevention. And I'm sure it comes from a really well-meaning space, but also at some point it is a little bit based on rejecting not just very recent evidence, but evidence from essentially the last few decades, right? In terms of how our body really functions and what movement is to us. So me and Celeste are going to get into some specifics of it, but essentially, particularly in yoga, I think there's a lot of it, in Pilates as well, but there are certain areas of the body that are the attention is commonly drawn to them as somehow being incredibly fragile, such as low back, knees, neck, wrists. I feel like those are like almost the main four sort of culprits of this attention. And if you think about it logically, which I hope me and Celeste will be able to bring you on this path, is that it almost doesn't make sense. Like, we see two joints that work in a very similar way in a completely different light, and we cue them really differently. And with safety, and I think the argument for safety is like, yeah, I want to keep people safe. And I'm going to do it just in case. Like, what's the harm? And there is, no, you aren't doing any harm. And then what I personally found shocking is that there is actually negative consequences to these safety narratives in terms of people's ability to move, people's resilience, their body's adaptability, but also very real consequences of people, for instance, experiencing pain at the words or at these narratives. So this is very serious stuff. And I kind of reject this idea that, okay, just in case, I'm never going to ask people to do a squat, or I'm never going to ask people to do a forward fold, or there's so many things. I personally even had like a list of poses back in the day in my head that I would never ever teach, because they were supposedly so harmful, even though it's a body, like, I teach weights now, but at the time it was either that weights are dangerous in a way, but like inherently have a body weight practice, and suddenly like one twist to the right, one leg up or something is presented as a grave danger, and that will bring many consequences down the line. Isn't that, it's funny in retrospect, but I was into it.
I mean, I was into stuff like this as well, and I think where the final straw was when I was a part of this yoga group, and they were posting like really harsh photos of someone doing a no-handed cobra, and they were ripping this person apart, going, "Look how dangerous this is! Imagine the facet joints, the strain." And I was thinking, this is a position we put babies in for tummy time. Like, this is how we strengthen their posterior chain. And then thank goodness Z Health came into my life, and they were like, do you know, the brain works on a predictive mechanism, and if you're getting it to predict that there's going to be all this harm, maybe that's what's causing the harm. And I was like, wow. But also I started realizing how powerful safety culture is in marketing.
Oh, hugely. Because, I mean, and Celeste, I'm sure, will articulate it in a more eloquent way, but essentially our brain is kind of wired for finding threats, right? And inherently our body loves to keep us safe. And it's an amazing mechanism. I mean, if you have a tap of water running and you don't know it's hot and you put your hand under the water, you're going to pull the hand back right away. You don't have to consider like, ooh, what's the temperature? Like, you essentially the mechanism, automatically you're going to pull your hand back. It's wonderful. But also, I'm sure many of us have an experience of something that's not a literal threat, but put us in great anxiety. Like, you get one email or you have a phone call you're expecting, and you can get physical experience of, for instance, I get like a pain around my stomach, around my diaphragm. And I know some people get, around their jaw. These types of tensions can manifest in different ways. But what I'm saying is what you see in your mind and marketing can affect our physical experience as well. And adding social media to the mix, where things are now short. I mean, crazy sweeping claims, the type of reels. I operate mostly on Instagram, but the type of reels that are going so viral, 3 seconds of like points of view, you've done this one move and your back pain is healed and you can now sing and you got a PhD, whatever those are, right? It's really extreme. And then I think because the common narrative around movement, let's say you Google 5 exercises to do at the gym, so many of these articles will be around things not to do. There is such a focus on not, like the red cross, the visuals even, like really, I feel like ignite our imagination. And when people start moving, which, let's get one thing straight. Most adults in the world, and I don't want to use the word enough and stuff, I want to put too many expectations, but in general, we can probably commonly agree that a lot of adults don't move quite enough to look after their body. So as movement professionals, our job is to get people moving, I think, inherently. And yes, there is technique and things to worry about there, but creating this more positive association between movement and connection with people's body, I feel like is the most fundamental thing every movement professional should be doing. And the other things, they come later. So imagine if someone hasn't been moving for a while, maybe they also, because of what the picture of health is societally, they also feel like there's something wrong with them. They feel like they've been doing these fitness challenges where their waist was supposed to be snatched in 5 working days and it's not, so it's probably it's their problem. We think, we really consider through our lens that there's something wrong with us. And then we want to find someone to trust. And you see on social media these extreme claims with the red marks of like, never do this, or like 5 mistakes you're doing. And the mistakes are always just so general, and I feel like so deeply discouraging for people to move that they feel almost paralyzed from doing anything. And then you think, okay, well, if I'm going to trust someone, I need to trust this professional because they probably know they should, because all they talk about is don't do this, don't do this. If you do a squat this way, you will injure your knees. If you do a forward fold, you have a herniated disc. If you stretch your hamstring, you're gonna have yoga bad. So many of these things that they're so commonly put out there in such a casual manner, I feel like really, really get into people. And I will say as well, I was actually speaking about it with, I do some mentoring for teachers. And I was actually speaking about it with a teacher yesterday who's a physiotherapist as well. And we're speaking about this issue of the more you study movement, the more you realize that almost, technique matters, but it's not a matter of life and death as it may originally seem. But then when people come to your classes, often you're considered more of an authority or a knowledgeable teacher. You can actually build trust better if you're being incredibly detailed, almost over managing people. And we're talking about this fine line of how do you get people to start moving with you? And then we can explain that our bodies are actually incredibly adaptable. And yes, you can bend your knees and you can straighten your elbows and all these such human things that if you recorded yourself going throughout your day, you would see how you walk up and down the stairs, how you get in and out of your bed, how your muscles just fire naturally, and there is not that much to fear. But in the movement industry, I think with the sweeping claims, with the negative language, and our brains are kind of sometimes, I don't want to make a claim around this, but our brains can be a little bit wired for negativity, right? Am I correct in saying this, right?
Absolutely. Because we're looking for threat, we're looking for danger, and that's essentially a good thing because it's trying to keep us safe, but it can become hypervigilant as well.
Yeah. So if we see, and in terms of examples, for instance, I mean, on my Instagram videos, and mind you, to anyone here who may be new to my work, so for the longest time, I would just basically post body weight movement. So movement based on how we move in daily life anyway. And now I like to add in some weights as well, but by no means am I an Olympic powerlifter. Not that there's anything dangerous in that, but yes, I understand the argument, like if I was going to lift up 150 kilos, there probably needs to be some serious prep, right? Because load management and so on. But even in the most mild videos, I remember a specific example of a video about knees where I was doing a lunge. So one leg forward, one leg back. I was going up and down. and at the top of the lunge, I straightened my knee. And comments being like, just so you know, you're going to wreck your knee, like, rah, 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 so angry. And lots of people also feel that, how can you be a movement professional? Like, what's your certification? If you're telling people they can straighten their knee. And you think, oh my God. And you want to approach it with compassion, because sometimes when people get aggressive, whatever. But sometimes it's actually such a, sincere, like a gutting message. Actually, on another video about knees I posted. And it was one exercise, I think, had a 5 kilogram weight, which consider to everyone here. Like, we lift up chairs at home.
Shopping,
Shopping.
exactly, sofas.
Yeah, 5 kilos. I mean,
Kids.
for yeah, kids, dogs, everything, and out of it was like squats, some jumps, whatever. And one of the comments was like, "Oh, I want to try this, but I'm so afraid I'm gonna wreck my knees or my body." Like, the words were so loaded, and I was thinking, like, I was actually gutted reading this, because by no means am I here saying like, "Oh, what an uneducated person," commenting under my video, but more that the way this narrative is pushed upon us, and I was victim to it as well, is so strong that we are afraid to do a bodyweight squat, which is, as me and Celeste were speaking before we came on here, think about how people were shitting in the forest for thousands of years.
Poos in the woods.
Yeah, and guess what? What
I want to
what
be afraid
mechanism
of
is
doing my
that?
poo in the woods.
No, sometimes we all have to do it, and the knees are designed to bend. I mean, our joints are designed to move, both to bend but and to straighten as well.
Absolutely. And I feel like when this marketing language is used, people make more money. And so they become habitually addicted to it just through the sheer success that they've gained through using this incredibly terrifying language.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we see it in other departments of life, right? That on social media in general as a whole, to go viral, right, we have controversial things, things that build up, see a lot of emotion, or like, I don't know, puppies, everyone loves that, right? But to have a real sort of level of nuance, which is so hard to give, even if you maxed out 90-second video, it's still so hard to give nuance. And then you would like the other person to tune into it as well, right? You would like to make some difference. You're probably making this content because you feel passionate about something and you want to share. And then I kind of understand why people fall into this path of, okay, I'm going to make this one sweeping claim because this is really clickable and it's a lot of emotion, and maybe I'll get some angry comments, but eventually it's going to put me on people's For You pages, all that stuff. But on the other hand, though, wouldn't you agree that, like, you know, business is business, but losing sort of our moral compass is the other thing. And I personally believe there is a way to do business in a way that you can look yourself in the mirror, in the eyes at the end of the day and think, okay, I'm not making money off people's fear. And also it creates such dependency between the trainer and the person. Because if everyone on earth is wrong but this trainer, if everyone here is harming you, if everyone is causing you injury, if everyone's telling you go squat but squats actually wreck you, or if everyone's telling you go forward fold that it actually wrecks your low back, then it feels like you cannot leave this trainer. It's
Otherwise,
such
bad things are going to happen.
Yeah,
It's codependency.
100%.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe that I'm having like a revelation as I'm sat here. You're absolutely right. We're creating a codependent culture within the movement world, which is really sad. Well, I mean, maybe we can get into you've mentioned a few. Some people say if you do a forward fold, you're going to get a herniated disc. Squatting was the recent one that we saw. Very viral video, by the way, guys. Obviously, marketing geniuses saying that if you do squats, you're going to give yourself, I don't know, what was it? Scoliosis? They were saying
No,
scoliosis.
it was
and
actually
knee
like 10
issues.
different things. Yeah.
They gave like a long list of issues you're going to develop in your body by doing squats. And I was like, for thousands of years, we've been squatting. Why is squatting an issue? Like, it's so upsetting. But what are some other ones that are really triggering for you? When you hear them, you're like, honestly, are we still saying this absolute crap?
Oh, and I'll give for context in terms of my triggering. So I actually have scoliosis, and as a kid, I was actually hospitalized. I was in like a medical facility for a month as a teenager to sort of do rehab every day for a month. I was out of school. And the doctors there, in retrospect now, were so nocivic, so negative, that imagine that I was told at the age of 13 that I'll be in a wheelchair by the time I'm 21. I'm 25 today, by the way, so I mean, not today, but yeah, but doing pretty fine. But this is like such loaded words to say to a child. And I was told basically that I can't do any sports, that I can't do any jumping, that my body is incapable as it is, that everything I'm doing is dooming myself. And I think somehow like it was such a shocking experience that my parents kind of pulled out, and they realized, but this is here in Poland, very well-known doctor in a very big hospital, you know, not just like a person with authority, I would say. So things around the spine, and so many people who come to Starlight I've met in my in-person classes also have come from this background of scoliosis, or even worse, their PT or someone has visually diagnosed them with kyphosis or whatever, and they say, oh, I wish I could do it, but I actually can't do a forward fold. I'm not allowed. And sometimes if I just suspect it, and I don't rehab people or anything, but I see them doing something similar, I'm like, oh, do you want to try? Like, just on your own terms, do you want to try doing a fold? And then they do a fold, they're like, wow, nothing is happening. And I'm not trying to, people have all kinds of situations around their spine, so I'm not trying to say that no one has a scoliosis more severe than me. But in terms of this language of symmetry, of expected perfection, of obsession with this everything being linear in the body, or else you explode and you're dooming yourself if you're moving, is so harmful in the long term, both to our mental health and also has consequences because people move less.
I think that's like the biggest fear, isn't it? That should be our biggest fear. You should be afraid of not moving as opposed to afraid of moving.
Exactly. So with specific things for me, like some of the biggest eye rolls, I mean, core is a huge one, coming from a Pilates background as well. And the core is a really big one as well, because I think in recent years with the spinal flexion, so spinal flexion rounding for anyone might be listening, when you round your spine forward, kind of like cat and cat-cow. So I feel like that was demonized, but I feel like now it's okay. And I actually see people doing Jefferson curls and stuff. So that is going okay. But the core engagement, so the common core cues in my head are engage your core to protect your low back, pull your belly button to spine. Mm-hmm. And it's always like, make sure your core is engaged or blah, blah, or tight, or blah, blah, blah. Like there is some consequence that's contextual to the position you're in. Like protect yourself by flexing your core. And you may think, okay, but the word protect is so neutral. Someone listening to this may think like, better safe than sorry.
Deal, Lena?
Yeah, better safe than sorry. First is actually, a topic I know that's really close to Celeste's heart as well, but gripping our core, which actually is supposed to work automatically with our breath. So our core is always a little bit engaged when we're upright, right? But our core engages and disengages depending on the demand and with our inhale and exhale. Versus if you're just gripping your abdominals, first of all, that really isn't a strong core. The way I explain it on Starlight is, imagine if you clench your fist. Is that a strong arm? Like, and don't get me wrong, like clenching your fist has a purpose. You want to pick something up off the floor? Sure, you will clench your fist. But if you're clenching your fist day and night, you're not going to end up with a really strong arm. You're actually going to end up with a really stiff hand that struggles to grip things and struggles to work in a normal way. And similarly with our core. So if we're always gripping, first of all, the lower back isn't any more protected by the muscles in your abdominals, the one that we consciously grip, right? So it doesn't really makes that much of a difference. You could, if you grip your abdominals, yes, you won't be able to extend, back bend your spine as much. Sure, depends what position you're in and what you're doing. But in general, as a blanket statement to say like you always should be engaging your core to keep your spine upright, yada, yada. It basically just means you disrupt your normal breathing patterns. Often it can mean that we breathe very shallowly in the chest. If you've been watching Bridgerton, very popular now, kind of like the Regency ladies when they're like in their neck and in their chest, which can look really beautiful on TV, but think about when you're anxious or stressed.
Extremely dysfunctional.
Yeah, that's how we breathe. Like, it's
but even
intense.
Severe breathing pathologies like COPD, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, they breathe up, and it's so crazy. It changes the physical structure of their rib cage, and it exacerbates breathlessness extremely powerfully.
And it also, and in terms of, because the core involves so much of the center of our bodies, also affects our pelvic floor as well. So if we're always in this grip state with our abdominals and we never relax with the big breath, our pelvic floor is always tight as well. And if you think like, okay, tight pelvic floor, great. Same with the fist analogy. It's not tight because it's strong. It's tight because it's so overworked. So we really need this sense of balance, like adding this relaxation to our body. And especially in the world where so many of us speak of anxiety and feeling like even when we come home, it's hard to get out of this anxious state. But at the same time, for so many of us, we wear super tight pants, we keep sucking our abdominals in, and this whole like engage your core, zip your belly button in, beautifully feeds into diet culture and make yourself as small as
Yeah,
possible.
and how
And
disgusting are you if you have a stomach that hangs out?
yeah, yeah. So it's always about being, a little tiny mouse that's, suck everything in.
That's when
And
you're so much more acceptable and lovable.
100%. And then in so many conversations I have had with my members and stuff, like they say, that sometimes after we speak about it, they notice that they would even subconsciously stuck their stomach in when at home. Or think if someone pulls out the camera to take a picture of us, what's our first reaction often?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and I'm not saying this in a judgmental way at all, because I live here too. I'm also a victim to that same thing. But I think we can slowly make changes, first in movement, breathing consciously. I recently did a class on some diaphragm mobilizations, and so many members actually said at the end that they feel high from like really mobilizing and getting the breath coming through and out. And it's this incredible
Fantastic.
experience where really our breath, like breathing is such a fundament of our cognitive abilities of being able to move, of neuroplasticity, right? So being able to create change in your brain. I'm really oversimplifying these processes, but basically think that oxygen feeds you and feeds your brain. We need to breathe properly. So it is within your best interest to grip the core less. Sure, your abdominals engage sometimes when you do curl ups, for instance. All good.
Or when
But
you
it's,
lift a heavy object like a sofa,
yeah.
it will engage. You don't have to think it so hard. But you know what I find fascinating, Lena, is I don't know if you've ever watched a little baby just learn how to walk, but their little tummy is always out and they're perfectly safe and they're lifting up things like mango. They're like, whoa, look at this treasure, mango. And you can see them squat, their little tummy hanging out, and they stand up with their treasure. And it's so funny how as soon as they're a little bit older, sometimes 5 years old in a ballet class, they start being told they need to suck their stomach in. And oh my God, by the time they're teenagers, how disgusting are you that your stomach's hanging out? And from that young age, all of a sudden it's unethical to do that to a baby, but not unethical from 6 years up.
Oh, 100%. And if you especially consider kids, and even if we talk about the core, because I think there is a lot of anxiety around core, and there is oftentimes, like, people ask me even on Instagram, not that I rehab people, but I think as a movement professional, you are often this first point of contact when people experience pain or injury. So even though I really believe in staying in your scope of practice, I think having at least a broad understanding of how pain science works can help you refer people to the relevant professional, and also sort of not push them into more pain. Because oftentimes people will ask like, oh, my knee has been hurting for 2 days because I knocked it on my sofa, should I have surgery? And you can just ease them down and be like, okay, maybe wait a week, let's see. But in saying this, though, something I feel can really work in our imagination, if you are someone who's anxious about like, but if I'm not engaging my core, then is my spine not aligned, or this on that? Think about those, generally speaking, a group most physically capable in our society today are kids, right? They run, they twirl, they fall, all kinds of things. And have you ever seen a child go on a slide on a playground and be like, ooh, let me just engage my core before I slide to protect my lower back? And children also have cores. They just engage automatically, right? Imagine if you're jumping into a pool and you're kind of like, it just happens naturally for us. Our body is incredible, and we don't need to rewire it on purpose, especially if it feeds into the awful diet culture narratives of like small, tiny, what is healthy, what is fit, blah, 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 all that shit.
Oh, I just love that you preach this, because for me, it is such a pain point seeing how still, after all the work that I've put out there about the core, all the people I've interviewed, all the lectures I've done, people are still going, you need to engage your core, or more core is like a slogan. More core. I'm like, no, less core, less. Chill out. let the brain automatically do it for you. You don't need to think so hard.
And have you noticed as well, actually, this one has been also a big eye roll for me recently, is, how there has been so many trends sort of around moving the core and more about core stability. So I've seen so many videos are, in essence, they'll be like, stop doing curl ups because they create too much pressure, or lots of fear mongering around curl ups, crunches
How do you get out of
in
bed?
general. Yeah,
You play with a baby lying on your back, like you're going to do these movements. Oh.
exactly. And instead, and I'm not saying core stability isn't a thing, but essentially, right, our spine sometimes moves, whether it's forward and back when you get out of bed, side to side, whether you do a back bend. And sometimes we try to have our spine not to move too much. Maybe when you're picking up a box, right? So you're resisting load and you're trying to lift it up. So then those are two very different functions. And I think in a world where with these sweeping claims and marketing, and if on social media you try to make yourself different, or you try to feel like, okay, I have my secret method, and my secret method is never do a curl up because it adds pressure, like there's some theory that's made up based on some cherry picking, it can feel like, okay, I can sell my method now. Like I have this secret thing that nobody else has.
Yeah, it again comes back to marketing, doesn't it?
Yeah, versus really, and it's so unsexy, you know, like I struggle with it too. It's so unsexy that like my best movement advice is just like there's some detailed advice I have, sure, if you come to my classes, but broadly it is like get yourself moving, walking, sure, running, sure, weights, sure. It's all better than sitting down in fear, truly.
Oh, it's so good. Oh, I love that we're having this chat. Are there any other, before we move on, eye roll moments that you've heard out, like just certain cues that are kind of centered around safety culture that aren't like just any big ones that you think, oh goodness, how is this still being taught?
Do you feel the one about never hyperextending? Like never looking in your knee
Oh
or never
my
looking in the
goodness.
elbow?
Yeah, micro bend. We must micro bend always.
And again, I'm not saying I never teach a microbend. I think, the joint needs to be able to move in a variety of ways. And sure, for instance, if we are already in a situation that feels challenging, let's say we're in a class and we're doing a big deadlift for everyone, it feels like, okay, I'm pushing my boundaries a bit. Then if usually we would do it with a micro bend or even a seriously bent knee, because that's familiar and we can feel more maybe support through the heel. So I'm not trying to make it sweeping like, okay, you always should have your knee hyperextended. It really is contextual, but I think you can still provide this information saying like, hey, try microbending here, or let's all bend our knees here and see how it feels without demonizing the other thing. I think that's really important in teaching, because even those things that traditionally, let's say the never flex your spine, so never round your spine, right? And there has been a list of things to never do, like seated forward folds. But sometimes in classes, I do find myself teaching, like I actually would like for them to stay in neutral. Let's say you're doing bird dog, right? And I think it's important to, okay, you teach them the difference between moving around and being neutral and show them, what the signals are, but you can really emphasize that the other isn't wrong, it is just different. But for the purpose we have right now, which is core stability, whatever the theme of the class is, this is why we're doing it this way. But you're not wrong, or I feel like it's really important to put it in context and avoid these sweeping claims while we teach, but especially on social media, even though I sympathize with the fact that it's hard. And me and Celeste spoke about it, that I think a lot about, like, you'll see a 15-second post for me, and probably the most thought I've given it is, how do I say this in a concise way without actually making a claim that would basically be misinformation, but also one that's digestible maybe to an audience that's not super into movement, and sort of they need this information to be really accessible and obvious. It's very hard.
It's very hard. That's why I really like your page, is I can tell you've actually put some thought into everything you share. And so, thanks for kind of running through that for us. And I feel your pain. I feel like slowly we'll get there. I feel like also you probably have something that if you said this, maybe you get burned at the stake for saying this out loud. But what is one kind of controversial thing that actually you think everyone should know? However, you're almost afraid to say it.
One for me, which has been coming up recently, is that injury prevention at the core really is not a thing, and you will likely injure yourself at some point, and that is fine. And I think there could be such a knee-jerk reaction, like, oh my god, as a teacher, your class will injure me, burn her at a stake, what is she doing? But hear me out. I mean, our body moves in all kinds of ways, very spontaneous too, right? Think about what life is like. I mean, you sometimes have to run to a bus, or maybe you lifted up a box and it's heavier than you expected. If you have children, right, they do all kinds of crazy things, jumping at you. And sometimes unexpected things happen and you will get injured no matter how much bulletproofing you do. I mean, imagine people who are really in business of not being injured, like professional athletes who get paid so much money to go and basically perform for us. And if they get injured, a lot of money is lost. They have a team of physios, masseurs, logistic, whatever, and they still sometimes get injured and even have to get into surgery. And I know the argument is that the athletes do really extreme things, but they also have really extreme prep. So where I'm going with this is to almost trust our body a little bit more and fear movement and subsequent injury less, because the best thing we can do, and something we know about the body, which is absolutely amazing, is that it's adaptable. It heals. It's a living being. So contrary to, let's say, a car that like breaks down and yeah, you can bring it to a mechanic, but like it's probably never going to be as good and you probably need to get rid of it eventually. You do actually get better. So even setting injuries aside, if you've never run before and you were to run a marathon today, I don't know if you would get injured, but likely this type of load would be really extreme and for your tissues, because you're not ready for it from 0 to marathon. But how is it that 2 or 3 years from now you could run a marathon? How is it? Because your tissues are changing. So if you've been preparing for the marathon, your body suddenly can do it. You're a living being. And it's same with injuries. So whether it's sort of a life injury of like, okay, you hit something, something fell on you, you know what happened, or maybe something happened in a class, I wouldn't encourage to spend too much time on thinking, okay, what should I have done if I, did some more ankle rolls or knee this, or I've seen like crazy, some injury prevention drills that are just incredibly complicated. And I'm instead thinking, okay, like, our body adapts. You probably need to rest. You probably need to rehab. I'm not a specialist in rehab, but where I'm going with all this is the narrative around bulletproofing and don't do this because it's injurious. I mean, there's so much negative press about yoga, for instance, that yoga is so injurious, even though if we look at the evidence, it's actually very safe. And I mean, it's mostly a body weight activity. So if you think about it logically, it is also quite safe. And sure, maybe there are some sports that are more extreme, like American football or something, that you have a higher likelihood of injury. But in general, if we think about a civilian, someone who's like, okay, I want to go to the gym, I want to go to Pilates class, aerial yoga, then don't let this sort of kinesiophobia, like this fear of movement, stop you. Because on the flip side, and I'm struggling still to communicate this message without feeling like I'm installing fear, but not movement has a bigger amount of consequences, both in the
And
moment.
and limited movement as well. So if you've got these fear-mongering neutral spine always, engage your core always, that limiting movement, it also carries risks. In fact, how we've described it in terms of the neural thing is a lack of input to the brain is as threatening as excessive input, such as a trauma. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it is, right? And how I actually was thinking about this quite a bit when I was reading, I think it was like American National Guidelines for Movement for Pregnant People. And because in pregnancy, there's so much fear mongering as well, and like a gazillion list of things you should never do. They're so extreme. And when in reality, this recommendation was basically like, yeah, you should continue your movement. You can pretty much do everything. And the main thing they were highlighting is that the consequence of not moving would be much more serious, both for the person carrying the baby and the baby potentially, than any injury that could potentially come from movement. And sure, there are risks, but there's risks in getting out of your house if it's icy. You can have an asteroid fall on your house. I don't know, lightning rod shoot you. Like, life is risky, unfortunately. I'm an anxious person. I think about a lot of this stuff too, but at the core, doing movement prepares you for life. So demands of life are going to stay the same. The loads of life, gravity is on always. You cannot switch it up. Things fall. Accidents happen, and you either can do your best to be prepared for them by moving your body in some way, or you either cannot prepare and take it on. But either way, these forces of the world are gonna work on you. I'm sorry, the shit happens.
Yeah, I think that should be the slogan that we have tattooed on our foreheads. Just shit happens, guys. Tell me, if you had to, is there anything else that is really close to your heart that you'd like to kind of share before we wrap up? Because we're kind of running out of time a little bit, and I'm just mindful if there's anything we haven't covered that you are passionate about sharing with the world, like now's the time.
In terms of, I think there's quite a few things, but in terms of the safety conversation, I think especially for any teachers to listen to us, and we've kind of alluded to this point at the start around that there is such thing, like you kind of be like, oh, just in case I'm gonna not have people hyperextend their knees, or just in case I'm gonna have people switch their cores on, that the language we use really matters. And when you're teaching, you are a figure of authority in some way. So what you say matters to people. And same as there is placebo, right? So in clinical trials, right, let's say you took a sugar pill and you had amazing effects, even though no medication, you didn't take any medication. Nocebo works in an opposite way, which means there are real consequences of having an expectation that something negative is going to happen. And we may think like, okay, how does it relate to movement? Like, I don't tell people, okay, you're gonna have a stomach ache if you come to my class. But even with really subtle things, especially ones that are repeated, like, okay, protect your knee by flexing your foot, or never let your knee go over your big toe, or that, like the protect, never. Or I even remember one time in a teacher training I did, there was a big fear installed around like shifting a shoulder forward in plank, for a chaturanga in yoga. And it's hard to do a chaturanga that way, but it's different ways to move. And I remember nothing was said. It was the sound of like, ooh, yeah. It's this sound that
like
even
twitchy, the eye twitch when they were like, that was the baby cobra without hands.
Yeah.
And everyone was going, oh, and I'm thinking, guys, really? I mean, this is so basic. Like,
it really is.
Like when I'm texting in bed, I'm in this position.
Yeah. And if anyone's interested in looking into it in like a more specific and evidence-based way, there's a researcher called Matthew Huey, and he's a co-author of a book on physiology of yoga, but I believe he wrote a dissertation essentially around language of yoga, and has really put together sort of the science of like what we know about nocebo and how it applies to a yoga environment. It's actually amazing. So, because I teach mostly Pilates and movement now, but still I feel like the yoga world is actually one of the ones that moves forward a little bit faster in terms of not just an evidence-based approach, but also this mind-body connection and expanding a little bit just beyond the musculoskeletal. We're really seeing that we are an incredibly complex organism, and we're not just like separate groups of, just like a bicep and a glute and a femur, but really it all works together, and looking both at our brain, but also the other systems in the body can really help us to move the person as a whole, as opposed to just sticking to either what it's really aesthetic goals or just this movement that feels kind of disconnected from being human and our natural ability to move.
And so with that being said, if you had a message for the world, a bumper sticker, some kind of billboard that everyone on the planet could read, what would your message to the world be?
I think it'll be trust your intuition. And that sounds so basic. But in a movement context, sometimes we are in a position, people are like, oh, my right hand feels tight here. Move it. Like just, it feels like my feet are too close. Yeah, they probably are. Move them. Like sort of like to really apply. So this is in the movement context, but also if you're, let's say, on a social media of marketing, as we spoke about, if something feels, if you like, trust your gut on it. Like I'm learning this the older I get, and I feel like I really denied my intuition in situations. So how sometimes you in real life find yourself in sort of a dodgy situation, and I feel like sometimes as a woman especially, you're like, don't overreact, like don't be this way. But I'm like, I know internally that something is off, but I also you can really tune in and trust your intuition, and that something is right. And I think in movement inherently it sounds so holistic, but we do have a lot of wisdom about our own body. You can have an instructor that has 10 PhDs, but you are the professor of your own body, and together you can collaborate with the information of the instructor and how you understand yourself and create something really beautiful.
Amen. Let's have a big applause for Lena, guys. That was very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Where can people find out more about you?
Thank you. If you resonate with what I share my wiggles and my thoughts on my Instagram, Starlight Movement. And starlightmovement.com is where you can find my classes. I have a movement platform called Starlight. Everything is SSSSS Starlight. And that's where I do weekly classes and education. And the platform is really sort of human and community based. So we look at movement from many different perspectives. We do some Pilates, some weights, and we've been doing some sort of childlike, intuitive stuff. But it's also not a space where it's like you against 1 million members, but really it's quite a small community. People get to know each other, you get to know me. And I really feel that movement can be a base to something, a way deeper of a connection. And that's something me and my members are seeking there. So
Amazing.
I invite
Thank
all
you.
if you're into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Check her out, guys. What a legend. You're awesome and you're such a brilliant communicator. It was a pleasure having you on Love at First Science.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me and trusting me with your time and your space, Celeste. What a pleasure. Honestly, you're such an inspiration.